Okay, welcome to video 12. This is our final video in Canon Law I for spring semester um, 2020. Thank you for your patience and for um, tolerating the way we've had to convey information the second half of this semester. Um, I think we've all tried to make the best of it, and it is not. I certainly feel like there's a loss compared to having our discussions together, and I look forward to those in the fall. I certainly hope we're back to normal then. But I hope we've covered as much as could reasonably be covered in this second half of the semester. And I'm just grateful, given everything that's happened this year, that at least we were able to begin together in person. Thank you for all your good questions on the videos and on your 3C1Qs. I think there's still another 3C1Q to grade, so if I can, I'll respond to some of those questions too. But I think those have helped at least maintain not a real substitute for our discussions, but at least a uh, replacement that captures some of the benefits. So uh, so thank you very much. Okay, so we do not have very much left to do in this lesson. We almost could have covered it in one video, but creating this chart um, was one of our big tasks for the semester, and it's our last, I think, really complex thing. What we're going to talk about in this video is preaching, Catholic schools, and publishing, things like imprimaturs, nihil obstats. But before that, I want to revisit something we talked about in video 11, which was also on this same lesson on the teaching office. I said towards the end that there's a difference, that the word definitive is used in two senses. One to describe a type of teaching, and the other to describe a type of proclamation. Um, we're probably stuck with that because a lot of people, namely Woodall, use definitive in both senses. I think to the extent possible, we should try to use definitive in only one sense, and then in the other sense, we can use a different word. And the one I'm well, I'm not really suggesting it myself, it's really the word we find in the doctrine of the faith documents, namely defining instead of definitive. Really the same meaning, but it will give us a different word so we don't. If you've studied this before, say Lumen Gentium 25, the infallibility of the church, the when the church's teaching is infallible, the primary and secondary objects of infallibility. One writer to study is our one of the writers we've talked about this semester, Avery Dulles. He wrote a book called Magisterium, and it's really pretty good on these issues. But what I would suggest to you, if you have looked at this, um, I bet most of you have found it to be quite complex and difficult, and especially difficult to remember where everything fits together. I almost feel like every time I have to teach it, I have to relearn it. Um, but anyway, so let's talk about this word definitive and see if we can. I think this word definitive is one of the reasons this is difficult because it's used in two ways. So okay, I hope this is readable. Um, Here's how definitive might be used: either to describe a teaching or to describe an act. And when I say act, I mean like a is is the teaching, um, is it proclaimed by a definitive act, meaning by the Pope speaking ex cathedra or by the bishops in council. Um, Another reason this word is kind of confusing is I don't know if this is confusing or unconfusing, but it has to do with infallible teaching or teaching within the at least one of the objects of infallibility. So, okay, when we're talking about a definitive teaching, we basically mean one that falls within the object of infallibility. So on our chart, if you have the blackboard chart, we're talking about the kind of the teaching, the most basic part of the chart. What is the teaching? And we've got, as we talked about in the previous video, a primary object and a secondary object. Now, what I'm saying here is I say this is definitive or infallible teaching. And if you look on the chart, it's hard to read here, but on your own copy, it says infallible/definitive. I just want you to be aware of something. I've got here infallible, especially the secondary object of infallibility. I think definitive, we're not exactly sure how it's always going to be used because it's become much more common since Vatican II, but we can use some examples. Um, it, it, I think it could be used to describe the primary object of infallibility, that is, things that fall within the divine revelation itself, the actual deposit of faith. Um, but I think perhaps more commonly, we're going to see the word definitive when we talk about the secondary object of infallibility. I think it can be used for both, but that's why when John Paul in 1994, he clarified the issue of the male priesthood, the document said this is to be held definitively, meaning it's a definitive teaching. Definitive means it's been decided. It has been you're to hold it definitively. There isn't there's a difficulty with your communion with the church if you reject this teaching. So that's what we and what's interesting is and I've also got the word irreformable. Both the primary and secondary object, those are irreformable teachings. They're not going to be changed. Again, I think definitive can refer to either the primary or the secondary object of infallibility, but I think we see it especially, at least so far since Vatican II, referring to the secondary object. But a defining act over here is different. There, when we talk about a defining act, we're still talking about infallible or definitive teaching. And again, this can be either the primary or the secondary object. We're not talking about the content of the teaching here. Here we're talking about how it's the mode in which it's proclaimed. And we talked about the two modes last time, either solemn or ordinary. So if it's solemn, and again, what's solemn? There's two ways to be solemn. The Pope proclaims ex cathedra, and often he actually will use the word we define. Or the bishops speaking in council, they can teach definitively. They can give a they can teach by a defining act, a definitive or defining act. As we said yesterday, though, sometimes they teach on discipline, so that would not be a definition. Versus ordinary. Ordinary is non-definitive, non-defining. It's still infallible, either in the primary or secondary object, but it's not proclaimed in this solemn way. So this example we just used is a good one, the male priesthood. As we said, it's a definitive teaching. I guess we should say it over here, a definitive teaching. And it's irreformable. It's in the secondary object of infallibility. So it is a definitive teaching. But how was it proclaimed? It was not proclaimed solemnly. It was proclaimed in an ordinary way. It was not the Pope speaking ex cathedra. It was him speaking in a teaching document, certainly a very important document, but it was proclaimed as through the ordinary magisterium, not the solemn magisterium. So we've got a definitive teaching, but not proclaimed by a definitive or defining act. That's why I'm saying on this side of the board, where we're talking about whether an act is definitive or not, that's how Woodall talks about it, a definitive act. I think we're better off to use the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's terminology, which we've got at the bottom here, where they talk about defining versus non-defining. Still the words are pretty close, but at least they're a little bit different. So at least we can use one word for the left side of this chart and one word for the right side. So anyway, that's my proposal. That's, I hope, a little bit more about what I meant in saying we need to distinguish the word definitive in whether it's being used about the teaching or referring to the act, referring to the mode in which the teaching is proclaimed. Okay, well, let's get on to the rest of our lesson on the teaching office. And here we're picking up on page 219 and 220. Woodall calls this area the ministry of the word, and he starts out talking about preaching. And he notes that on 220, under the 1917 code, the diocesan bishop gave the priest the faculty to preach. However, under the 1983 code, Canon 764, that is the universal law, gives priests and deacons the faculty to preach everywhere. So they have that faculty by the law itself. However, there are some qualifiers. You can't just walk into a church and start preaching because you're a priest or a deacon. You're going to need the consent of the pastor if it's a parish church, the rector if it's a non-parochial church. Also, the ordinary can, even though your faculty is coming from the law, the ordinary, he can remove the faculty. Also, particular law, that is the law that applies to a particular law in general. When we usually talk about particular law, it's going to be law made by either a diocesan bishop for his diocese or by the conference for the country. It can also apply to religious law. Particular just means it's not universal law. It does not apply to the whole church, but we're especially going to mean law that a bishop makes for his diocese. And the limitation there is that particular law can require express permission to preach. So we've got some tension there. The code does say that priests and deacons have the faculty to preach everywhere, but there are some qualifiers. Okay, Episcopal conferences, the conference of bishops in a country usually, can allow the laity to preach. However, the homily is reserved to the clergy, and the canons there are 766 and 767. And if you did the extra credit project on the document on lay collaboration, Ecclesia de Mysterio, you'll see that this idea of laity preaching the homily, this happened sometime in, say, the 1980s and 1990s, and the Holy See really put an end to it with that 1997 Ecclesia de Mysterio document. A couple other points about the homily that you may or may not know. It's obligatory on Sundays and holy days. unless there's a grave reason to omit it. Not obligatory during the week, though often, at least in the U.S., it's pretty customary to have at least a short homily. The content of the homily also is, I think some people think a priest can just, or deacon can talk about whatever they want, and in some places it seems like they do. But it's not really correct. The things that you are supposed to speak about are really limited. Scripture, especially the readings for the day, the liturgical year, the faith, norms, etc. Those are really the content of what the homily is. And I think in this day and age, it seems like most people do a pretty good job of having the homily connected to the readings of the day. And Woodall says on 222, the faithful, especially the faithful listening to the homily, they have a right not to be subjected to superficiality or wayward opinion in homilies, and they have a right to receive the sustenance that is their due. I think that's a nice point that he makes. We don't always think of the rights of the hearers. We think more of the ability of the homilist, but it is good to keep in mind the faithful and their rights when we're talking about this. Okay, Woodall has a couple of remarks on catechesis at 222. I'll mostly leave those for you to read. He points out, though, helpfully, catechesis is instruction for those who have been evangelized. You don't want to confuse catechesis with evangelization. So that those to be catechized, they're people who have received at least an initial proclamation of the gospel. Woodall makes another good point here related to the one we just mentioned. The faithful have a right to catechesis. And he makes a nice point where he says it's not just to the content, but also practice or conduct is important too. I'm not sure what he means by that. I don't know if he means the uprightness of the catechist or of the kind of the legitimacy of the worship in the parish. That is, worship according to the governing liturgical books. Probably both are significant, though. And he notes that parents have the primary responsibility, but obviously they're very often assisted by catechists in the parish. Okay, let's move on to Catholic education, which is, I should say, Woodall has a small section on the missionary work of the church, and he doesn't say a lot, but he does say that the church is missionary by nature, and that's again a very good point for us to remember, even if we don't have all that much personal experience with missionaries or with working as a missionary ourselves. And certainly our Glenmary brothers are a very good reminder in our community of the missionary nature of the church, and even of the need for mission work in a country like the U.S. that has been had the word preached for a long time, but still requires missionary activity. Okay, Catholic education, page 225 in Woodall. Here he again gives the stages of sort of education generally. First, he says, comes the announcement of the gospel through preaching, evangelization. Second, a deepening of knowledge through catechesis. And then third, I shouldn't say real, he says education. And I think there he means more, not that catechesis is not education, which it is, but perhaps education through further reading and even research in some cases. And he talks on 226 about the rights and duties of parents, and he points out very rightly that parents have the primary duty for educating their children, including with religious education, and that's in Canon 793, but also you could refer to Canon 226, sort of our Bill of Rights, talking about lay rights. But then his next section on 226 is about Catholic schools, and he describes schools as sort of the primary means to help parents to fulfill their educational role. He also has a note about the use of the term Catholic in a school name. Is a school entitled to use the word Catholic? And you can read about that in Canon 803, Section 1. It will tell you what makes it a Catholic school. Essentially, the church authority can make it a Catholic school, or if it is run by a public juridic person, say the Benedictine order, that also would make a school a Catholic school. Woodall raises an interesting question on 225, but I think he doesn't quite engage it fully. What about homeschooling families? And you may or may not have had experience with them. Pretty likely that most of you will at some point. And the question is, are homeschooling families justified in taking their children out of Catholic schools that they find inadequate? So he kind of raises this question. I don't think he quite answers it. Um, Personally, I think so. I think he's, if they think they can do the job better, and especially if the Catholic school is positively harmful, they really aren't teaching the faith, or they're trying but are just very ineffective in doing so. We've said the parents are the primary educators, so I think they really need to take these things into account and not just say, well, they're in a Catholic school, so I don't need to think about their education anymore. I think that's a mistake. I think, and actually, a more interesting question than the one Woodall raises is, what if the school is fine? There's no complaints about the school, but the parents just want to, because they're the primary educators, they just want to do the education personally themselves. Uh, I think there's really disagreement in the church about that. I've heard people both say yes and no. It's I think it's hard to get a direct answer looking just at the code. Certainly, the parents have their primary right to educate their children, so that certainly seems to lean fairly strongly in favor of the parents. However, the code doesn't only say that the schools are there to help parents, it also really urges parents to collaborate with schools in education. So I think if there's real cause for concern about the quality of the schools, at least personally, I do not. Just me speaking, but I do not have a problem with uh, parents taking their children out of school and teaching themselves. If there's no real complaints about the schools, but the parents just want to do the education themselves. Uh, Personally, I still think that that parental right is pretty strong. I think if push really kind of came to shove and you really had to answer the question, I think that the people with the primary duty, um, the parents, are legitimate in deciding to take care of the uh, religious education themselves. Doing the education, however, when they want their children to receive the sacraments, they do have to submit to the judgment of the pastor or the bishop or the bishop's delegate. Are they properly prepared for First Communion? Are they properly prepared for confirmation? So there's still a need for cooperation, but you may or may not visit those questions at some point. Next, Woodall goes on to Catholic universities, and back especially in the 90s, maybe in the 80s, there was a lot of um, a real big issue in Catholic media was the mandatum, and that's provided for in the canons on on Catholic universities. Basically, the mandatum being the uh, sort of a license from the bishop to teach uh, in the sacred sciences, especially theology. Um, okay, let's move on to social communications. So this includes both printed material, books and magazines, newspapers, but also radio and TV. Canon 831 says that the Episcopal Conference can issue norms for clergy or religious who take part in radio and TV programs. In the U.S., that actually did happen. I think most people have forgotten about it though, because it happened in 2002 or maybe the year before, maybe 2001, and it was a big story at the time, a pretty big story. But then uh, a few months later, the abuse crisis really erupted in Boston and to a lesser extent Los Angeles, several places throughout the country, but Boston and LA were really the epicenters, but especially Boston. And that really took all the air out of the room. I think even though the media norms were not that old, I think almost sometimes I feel like everyone but me has forgotten they ever were issued. I did myself. I did not care for the norms at the time. I thought there were some deficiencies, and I was kind of upset by it. And I feel like I sort of worried for nothing because everybody seems to have practically forgotten about them in light of this much bigger issue that was to come up. And obviously, out of the 2002 Boston crisis, that's where we got the Dallas norms. That's where called the Dallas norms because that's where the bishops met that year. The U.S. bishops. Okay, so the bishops have oversight, some type of oversight over the means of social communication. Again, we have to balance oversight with obviously the um, ability of the faithful to share their faith. The code seems to recognize that there is something special about electronic media, probably just because it has the capacity to reach so many people. So it does seem to give some additional prerogative or voice to the bishops or bishops' conferences there. Now, here's a subject you've probably heard about. If you've got old Catholic books or books you've inherited from your parents or grandparents, you'll often see the imprimatur or nihil obstat at the very beginning of the book, and those basically the censor is the person who reads the book and addresses the question: is there anything wrong with this from a perspective of Catholic faith? It's not an endorsement of the book. Nihil obstat just means, well, nothing prevents it being published. There's no difficulty of faith. It could be a terrible book, be terribly written, um, and have a lot of problems, but the nihil obstat only really looks at, and really the same with the imprimatur, only looks at, is there a problem? Is there a difficulty with faith? Um, and the imprimatur is really just the other side of the coin of the nihil obstat. The nihil obstat says there's nothing, there's no obstacle, essentially. And the imprimatur means let it be published. So you almost really don't need both. You won't see these. Sometimes you'll see both of these present in an older book, sometimes just one of them, and that's fine. There may be a bit of redundancy in using both terms. They are distinct, um, but they're quite closely related. What you sometimes will see now is you may not see either of these terms, nihil obstat or imprimatur. They're still used, but what you may see is something like published with ecclesiastical permission. That's language sometimes used in light of the current code. Well, the canons on especially books, what books require permission to publish. The canons to look at are 824 through 829. The takeaway here is that there are, in the past, almost any book dealing with theology, the expectation was that it needed to have church approval, nihil obstat and or imprimatur. Now the categories of books needing ecclesiastical permission for publication are restricted quite a bit. So not nearly as many books, not every book on religion or every book on Catholic religion. So you write a biography of Saint John Henry Newman. You don't necessarily have to have an imprimatur for that. You might wish to have one, and you can request it, but you don't necessarily have one. Here are the categories where you do need the permission. Books of scripture, that certainly makes sense. Liturgical books, again, you can see why. Prayer books, catechisms, again, obviously, a lot of these things, liturgical books, catechisms, they're really going to be the prerogative of church authority to publish anyway. And then books on theology or canon law that are to be used as textbooks. If the idea is not to use them as textbooks, they don't require church approval to publish them. If they're just going to be used as uh, scholarly resources, then they do not have to have church approval. Also, books that are to be displayed or distributed in churches or oratories, they also require ecclesiastical permission to publish them. So of the books that people are likely to write, people we know that are likely to write, it's mostly these two latter categories: books on theology or canon law that are to be used as textbooks or that will be displayed or distributed in churches or oratories. We haven't really talked about oratories. That's more of a canon law II subject. The short, what is an oratory? It's often the types of church-like buildings that you call a chapel. Often that's really an oratory, not really a chapel. So like a religious community that doesn't have a parish, that has their own sort of church-like building or church-like part of the building that they're in, that likely is an oratory. Um, so, okay. Um, let's see. We've talked about the censor. Oh, if you obtain, who gives the permission? Who gives the nihil obstat, the permission, or the imprimatur? It's either the author's bishop or the bishop of the place of publication. So you have two options. And the permission is only good for the first edition. So if you do a revised edition, you really should be seeking ecclesiastical permission all over again. Okay, the final thing that Woodall talks about on 227 is the profession of faith and the oath of fidelity, and these are printed in the code, and it's sort of an oath that are taken by people in authority. So those who make the profession of faith and profess the oath of fidelity, they are cardinals, bishops. This will happen when you take your office or close to the time that you take your office. Diocesan administrators, vicars general, episcopal vicars, judicial vicars, pastors, deacons, and professors of theology and philosophy in seminaries. Canon Law II, by the way. And the final thing Woodall says in this chapter is that the faithful have a right to receive orthodox teaching. Needless to say, that's the reason for all of these provisions that we've talked about. Okay, well, that concludes our lectures. Again, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your patience, your encouragement, and your hard work. And best of luck this summer and certainly on the exam, and I look forward to seeing you in the fall. Take care. God bless you.